Welcome back to the Why I'm Right podcast. I'm your host, Matt Taylor, and today we got breaking news. It is Saturday, April 6th, and today we're talking about Ukraine. Obviously, we've all heard over the last few years, the last 2 years specifically, about the war in Ukraine and everything going on between Russia and Ukraine and NATO's impact on that war and the United States' impact on that war. And for the last 2 years, I believe we've been getting part of the story. We haven't heard the full story. I don't think we ever get the full story, especially when you're talking about in mainstream media. You have to look beyond the headlines, and you have to look at different perspectives. And that's one thing in this country, and frankly, the world right now, that I think we lack is we hear one side of the story. We don't hear both sides of the story. So the story is Russia's the boogeyman in Ukraine. And maybe that's the case. Maybe it's not the case. But unless we're willing to ask the questions and seek the answers, we'll never know the full story. We'll never know if what we're being pumped, the propaganda we see day in and day out, where our Congress people, our representatives in Congress, instead of wearing a United States flag pin on their suit, have worn Ukrainian flag pins. We've seen this now going on. Zelensky has been in the White House. Zelensky has come over asking for more money. And every part of our society for the last 2 years, instead of the focus being on our own country, our own issues, because we got them here. We have a lot of issues going on in this country right now. And instead of focusing on our own countries, our own issues, this administration, this government, both sides of the aisle. I'm not talking about just Democrats here. I'm talking about prominent Republicans have had a focus on Ukraine instead of the United States. And so the breaking news that we're diving in today is that the United States Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, came out yesterday and said, quote, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Now, I think it's important to know he said this yesterday, and he made a bold statement. Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And so listen to this clip here. This is cut one. We're going to listen to Blinken say Ukraine will become a member of NATO, and then I'm going to dive into why it's important and why this is a major issue for not just the U.S., but possibly the whole world. Here's clip one.
Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership and to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward.
And so when we think about this, again, I just said there's both sides of the story here. Is it good for Ukraine to join NATO? That's a question. That's a question that you really have to look into deeply, because there's pros and cons. And with the amount of money, and I'm going to get into it a little bit later in this episode, we've spent over $74 billion in this war in Ukraine. We've sent more than $74 billion in aid to Ukraine. When is enough enough? And now we, our Secretary of State, instead of focusing on the issues of our state, the United States, is focused on Ukraine. And I get the main part of being the Secretary of State is to focus on foreign policy and to be an advocate for us around the world. So I get his focus is over there, but the issue I have here is he says, quote, Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And so before I dive in and really talk about the issue here, again, I started the podcast by saying we have to hear both sides of the argument. We have to hear both sides of the table in order to be able to come to an educated decision or an educated opinion. We have to hear both sides. So Tucker Carlson got a ton of heat when he went over to Russia and interviewed Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. And so I want you to listen to this clip. It's a little bit long. It's about 1 minute and 50 seconds, but just listen to this clip here. This is Vladimir Putin explaining that Russia was promised by the U.S. in 2008 and before in the 1990s, in the 1980s, that NATO would not expand an inch to the east. He goes on to then say there were 5 expansions to the east after that point, and this, if Ukraine does join NATO, which our Secretary of State just said will happen, that will be the 6th expansion to the east, closer to Russia. So if the U.S. presidents and the U.S. secretaries of state, he talks about Condoleezza Rice, he talks about administrations of the past, have promised Russia over and over that NATO would not expand to the east, and then we expand to the east 5 times, I understand frustration. And I'm not saying he has a reason or justification for going into Ukraine right now. Again, I'm not advocating for that. But again, if we've promised over and over, President, Secretary of State, government officials promised him over and over, we would not expand to the east, and then we expand to the east 5 times, this would be the 6th. Imagine if the roles were reversed. I'll get into that right after here. Here's the clip, 1 minute and 40 seconds. Just listen up. This is Vladimir Putin in an interview with Tucker Carlson talking about the importance of not expanding NATO and how countless times he's been lied to. Here's Putin.
Push back.
По поводу расширения НАТО на восток.
Now, about NATO's expansion to the east.
НАТО на восток?
Well, we were promised no NATO to the east, not an inch to the east, as we were told. And then what?
Что сказать? Ну,
They said, well, it's not enshrined on paper, so we'll expand.
5 расширений.
So there were 5 waves of expansion, the Baltic states, the whole of Eastern Europe, and so on.
И вот теперь прихожу к главному.
And now I come to the main thing. They have come to the Ukraine, ultimately. In 2008, at the summit in Bucharest, they declared that the doors for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO were open. Now about how decisions are made there. Germany, France seem to be against it, as well as some other European countries. But then, as it turned out later, President Bush, and he's such a tough guy, a tough politician, as I was told later, he exerted pressure on us and we had to agree. It's ridiculous, it's like kindergarten. Where are the guarantees? What kindergarten is this? What kind of people are these? Who are they? You see, they were pressed, they agreed. And then they say, Ukraine won't be in the NATO, you know? I say, I don't know. I know you agreed in 2008. Why won't you agree in the future? Well, they pressed us then. I say, why won't they press you tomorrow? And you'll agree again. Well, it's nonsensical. Who's there to talk to? I just don't understand. We're ready to talk. But with whom? Where are the guarantees? None. So they started to develop the territory of Ukraine.
So you hear it right there. After countless promises over and over, there would be no expansion to the east, not an inch to the east. We, and when I say we, at this point I'm talking about NATO. I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about NATO. Have expanded 5 separate times, and now we're talking about a 6th expansion. An expansion that, again, I started the podcast, and I will go back to it, with saying we need to see both sides of this. Because we've been fed propaganda for the last 2 years about the boogeyman of Russia and the narrative that Russia's bombing Ukraine, going after Ukraine. And again, I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just saying we need to ask both sides, look at both sides. And so I want to imagine for a second, I want you to imagine for a second that it was the roles were reversed, the tables were turned. If a group who adamantly opposed the United States promised the U.S. president, whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, whether it's Obama, whether it's Bush, whether it's all of them, at different times, if a group that adamantly opposed the United States promised over and over and over they would not expand closer to the United States. Again, they adamantly are against the United States. They promised they would not expand closer to the United States. And then there were 5 separate expansions, and each expansion brought the territory closer and closer and closer to the US border. And finally, they now make a 6th expansion, and that expansion includes, let's just say, Canada. That's what we're talking about here in Russia. That's what happened here in Russia. Is countless promises, we're not going to move an inch to the east. NATO won't expand an inch to the east. We then go 5 times to the east. NATO is adamantly against Russia. The propaganda of NATO, the propaganda of the US is adamantly against Russia. And finally, we're now in Canada. When I say that, finally, we're now in their Canada or their Mexico. This is right at the border of Russia. And so we're at a point where if it was us, if the roles were reversed, if the tables were turned, we would feel very threatened. And we would have no choice but to act in a certain manner. And so that's where we're at right now. That's where we're at in Russia. And again, I go back to it. We need to see both sides of this. And it's not like we haven't seen both sides of it. The US government has. Joe Biden has. And that's where I'm going next. This next clip that you're going to hear is actually a clip of Joe Biden, the now president of the United States. This clip's from 1997 when he was a senator. And he's talking about how expanding NATO to the east would result in hostility from Russia. It would force a reaction from Russia. And so here's Joe Biden. Here's Joe Biden in 1997 saying just that.
I think the one place where the greatest consternation would be caused in the short term for admission, having nothing to do with the merit and preparedness of the country to come in, would be to admit the Baltic states now in terms of NATO-Russian, U.S.-Russian relations. And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction, I don't mean military, in Russia, it would be that.
And so he says it right there. If expansion were to happen closer to Russia, that's when hostility would occur. That's when an issue would come. That's when there would have to be a reaction from Russia. And so Biden in 1997 knew this, yet now him and his administration through Blinken, the Secretary of State, are now advocating for NATO to expand closer to Russia than ever before. And so he knows there's going to be backlash. He knows there's going to be a response. There's no question about it. And again, this is not just accepting a state into NATO. We are actively funding. The United States is actively funding the war in Ukraine. NATO is actively funding the war in Ukraine. We're sending support. We're sending firearms. We are actively in war with Ukraine through supporting the Ukrainian military and supporting the Ukrainian government. And I said it earlier, we've spent more than $74.3 billion to Ukraine just in the last 2 years. When is enough enough? And again, I go back to this because it's important to note our country has issues. Our country could use that $74.3 billion that we sent over to Ukraine to answer our own problems, to be a solution for our own problems. Think about it. Our country has issues with immigration, fentanyl coming over the border, fentanyl killing thousands of people in this country. We got economic issues, inflation, migrant crime. We have issues in this country. And as a father, this is where the solution seems so simple to me. As a father, if someone told me to worry more about what goes on in my neighbor's house while my own kid and my wife was suffering, I would say you're crazy. And that's exactly what we're doing on the scale here in the US. We have our own problems. Our people are suffering. Our people have an issue with inflation. Our people have an issue with immigration. Our people have an issue with migrant crime. Our people have an issue with fentanyl coming over the border. Our people have issues in this country. They can't afford to go to the grocery store. And instead, our focus, our government's focus, the focus of this administration has been on what? On Ukraine. And now we announced they're going to be joining NATO. And again, I say this because if Blinken goes out in the public eye and says that Ukraine will join NATO, and they don't join NATO, we look stupid. The U.S. looks stupid. NATO looks stupid. So he can't go out publicly and say Ukraine will become a member of NATO and then it not occur. But like I said, Biden and this administration has said it countless times. Biden knew it in 1997. There were going to be repercussions. There was going to be backlash. There was going to be hostility if we did this. And yet we've done it 6 times, and now we're finally in their backyard. And like I said, when you get on an airplane, what do they tell you? If something happens, put your mask on before you help other people. Because if you don't have your mask on, you're not going to be able to help that many people because you're going to have an issue. And that's where we need to look at this from a country standpoint. And that's why when Trump says America first, or the Republicans say America first, that should be the focus of our government. Our government should focus on putting our mask on first before helping Ukraine, before sending 73, 74, whatever the number is at this point, $1 billion to Ukraine to fund a war that we caused. And when I say we caused it, Biden in 97 said if we expand NATO, there will be hostility and it would force a reaction from Russia. Yet now in 2024, we're expanding NATO into their backyard. And so none of this makes sense. We need to worry about America first. It's time. It's time to put our own mask on. It's time to focus on the families in this country, the citizens in this country. It doesn't make sense. And it plays the bigger argument. When somebody illegally comes into the country, I hate saying it, they shouldn't get more government support than people who are paying taxes. They shouldn't get support, free health care, debit cards for free, housing for free. And yet if you served in this country, you get nothing. It's time to focus on the American people, the American citizens, because guess what? When you are the president, or you are a representative of the Congress, or you're a senator, you work for the American taxpayer. So Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, works for you, works for me. And so at some point in time, they need to focus on their people, our people. And maybe, just maybe, if things get better in this country and we stop printing money to send it over to Ukraine, which is causing what? Inflation, which is one of the biggest problems in the country today. Maybe if we took that $74.3 billion and sent it to the border and stop the illegals from flying into this country, entering this country illegally, maybe if we did that and the country was in a good place, if we had our mask on, then we could start helping others. But we're not in a place to help others right now because America is not the America that we're advertised as. We aren't right now. We aren't. When the average person can't go buy a house or get a mortgage or go to the grocery store without it hurting their pocket, at some point in time, we have more issues in this country than we're willing to even admit. When our government is focused on helping other countries and helping illegal immigrants, more so than they focus on our own border, more so than they focus on our own people, more so than they focus on our veterans, that's when we have a problem. And that's where we're at today. And so as we're now 200 and whatever days from election day, it's time to really start thinking about if this is the direction of the country that you want it to go in. If this is the direction of the country that your family wants it to go in. Because like I said, these people work for you. They need your vote. It's not the other way around. Who's going to help your family more? That's what you should ask yourself. Who's going to help bring inflation down? Who's going to help stop crime at the border? Who's going to not focus on other countries and start focusing on our country, the American first agenda? And so again, the podcast is called Why I'm Right. All of these issues play into the role of why I'm right. Again, the name of this podcast is focused around the idea of these are the reasons I'm Republican. These are the reasons that I lean right on many issues, because it's common sense. And so they have their issues. Republicans have their issues, even with this Ukraine crisis. And that's why McCarthy's no longer Speaker of the House. He's one of those guys that, like I said earlier, wore a Ukraine pin, not a U.S. pin. And so he was fired. Again, it goes back to it. These people in our government work for you, the taxpayer. Work for you, the American citizen. And so as we end this podcast, again, when we start seeing breaking news, the U.S. is now advocating for Ukraine to join NATO, we need to ask the whys, especially when we look at the totality of what's really going on. When you find a clip of Biden talking in 1997 saying, if we expand to the east, it's going to force a reaction from Russia, retaliation from Russia, hostility from Russia. But yet now we've expanded to the east 5 separate times. This now is the 6th, and we're now out their back door. We're now their neighbor. NATO is now their neighbor if Ukraine joins NATO. And if the tables were turned and a group of countries who adamantly were against the United States continued to move closer and closer to our border, what would we do? How would we feel? And if they finally got to our border, we would feel targeted. We would feel threatened. And we would have no choice but to react. So Biden knew this. He knew that the action would have a reaction. And yet we're now advocating for it. His Secretary of State is now advocating for it. So we have to ask why. Is it because they're looking for war? That's what it would seem. But then again, why? So this has been the episode of the Why I'm Right podcast, and I just told you why I'm right.